Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last session of our webinar series about tax reform and international models of VAT and GST. So today, before we start, I just wanted to say a FGV disclaimer that all statements expressed by FGV employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts represent exclusively their opinions and not necessarily FGV's institutional position. Everyone presenting here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be posted later on FGV official channels. So for today, we have a great guest. It's an honor, and I'm very happy to have you here, Professor Emily Satterthwaite. And Emily will present a great paper about tax signaling. Emily has, let me see here, her CV, a BA on economics at Yale, a GD at Stanford Law School, also a LLM at University of Toronto, and an MA on economics at University of Toronto. And Emily was teaching as associate professor at University of Toronto, and she just moved effective July 1st, Emily. Emily joined Georgetown University Law Center, and Emily is a good friend of mine, and I'm very happy because she's a gift from Professor Richard Bird. Professor Bird introduced me to her, and I'm very happy. And here we have a lot of connection here in Toronto. Emily has a lot of research, and today she'll present this paper. Her research has a particular focus on entry-level business entrepreneurs and self-employed individuals. And her recent work has explored exactly the impact of VAT tax registration thresholds on these micro entrepreneurs, the relationship of these entrepreneur legal and tax status choices to their firm's chance for survival. And so it's really good to have you here, Emily. Thank you very much. Before I pass to you, I will pass to our co-host, co-organizer, Professor Rita de la Feria. Professor Rita has joined us here all these webinar series, and she helped us a lot with the organization, invitations of our guest speakers. So thank you very much for you too, Rita, because without you, this webinar series for sure will not be the same. So if you want to say something before we start.
Well, first of all, thank you. Obrigada a todos. Vou só dizer umas palavras em português para agradecer à Melina, ao Eurico e ao Isaías por me terem convidado para co-organizar estes seminários mais uma vez. Não só é um prazer organizar os seminários, mas é um prazer organizar com eles. Tem sido um enorme prazer trabalhar com eles tão diretamente. São todos pessoas excelentes, com conhecimento técnico enormíssimo, e para mim tem sido um enorme privilégio. I'll pass now to English just to say that Emily is the last seminar on a very successful series that we have had dedicated to kind of critical elements and critical topics in VAT design, legal design and implementation. I think I am not disclosing any secret to say that we actually invited Emily to come to our seminars last year because her research is just so interesting and so relevant from a policy perspective. Unfortunately, Emily could not accept it at a moment in time, but we were delighted when she was able to accept it this time. Her paper talks about a very kind of controversial issue in practice. So every seminar of this series, we have tried to focus on issues that are particularly controversial. And this issue of thresholds is one that has oscillated throughout the last 20 years or so and what is the best practice. So there are areas that we know what the best practice is, but this is one of those areas in which the best practice has been changing a lot, and we have thought different things at different times. So her paper actually talks about things that I see a lot in policy discussions. A lot of what she's going to talk about are things that policymakers specifically ask, and everyone has an intuition, and she's now going to deliver us the evidence on that intuition. At a personal level, I'm also delighted to see Emily here. She hosted me in Toronto not so long ago, and I'm already arranging, because Washington is great, so I'm already arranging my next visit to DC. As soon as this pandemic is over, I'm coming to Georgetown to visit her. And without further ado, our great guest, Professor Sarah Wade.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Melina Rocha and Professor Rita de la Feria. Thank you so much for including me in this. I can't tell you how excited I was to receive your email, Melina, because I was so sorry that I couldn't participate last year due to the pandemic and exigencies relating thereto that I'm sure everyone can imagine. But being here with the two of you, my favorite colleagues today, and one of the sad things about leaving Toronto was not being close to and hopefully being able to see Melina on a more regular basis. But I look forward to your visit, Rita and Melina, to having you here and to making the most of the cross-border connections. So I'm very grateful to be here. I am participating in a policy discussion surrounding the topic of this paper will be enlightening to me. I look forward to all following your email, Melina. I will speak for about I'll shoot for about 40 minutes. If you could give me maybe a heads up at like 20 minutes or so, I can set my timer. Would that be better?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Set timer for 20 minutes. And then hopefully we can, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the implications of what I'm proposing here. Rita, you are, at kind of ground zero of these debates about the threshold. At least to my knowledge, they weren't happening in as kind of high profile or as kind of research intensive way in Canada. And I really am hoping to learn what the experience in Brazil has been relating to kind of small firm issues. And so to the extent that the threshold is 0 or non-zero, I would really like to hear what the reactions. So hopefully there will be lots and lots of time for that. Does that sound okay with you guys? Okay, great. I'm seeing nodding heads. So I'm going to share my screen now. And try to go into, there we go. Everyone can see. Great. Okay. So the title of the project is Tax Signaling, and the focus here is exclusively, and perhaps it could be extended in the future, but the focus of the paper is exclusively value-added tax registration. And this little cartoon, with its shortcomings, is the fundamental motivation of the project, for the project. The concept that a entrepreneur, a small firm founder, or just kind of entrepreneur by necessity or by dint of dreams would go to a tax agency to say, I would like to register for a tax that I actually don't have to pay because I'm small enough. It strikes, I think, many people. It certainly struck me, even as someone who's quite interested in the structure of the VAT. It strikes one as somewhat improbable, and so the kind of hints that have emerged that this is exactly what is happening in some places is what led me to try to think more clearly about what the dynamic might be. And so I should, kind of the implausibility of this cartoon, therefore, is is my primary motivation for exploring this. This is just the background, or the roadmap for the talk, some background. I'll tell you about the signaling model that I'm applying. I'll apply it. I'm stopping here because the normative assessment is a place where there's some different kind of outcomes that could occur there. And last, policy implications. And so I look forward to the discussion about what those may be in different contexts, because I think something that I'll try to emphasize is that this dynamic seems almost certain to be very context specific. Okay, so first I'll start with some background, which for people who study VAT is no doubt, second nature. And so the piece of the VAT mechanism on which my discussion rests is the combination of a registration threshold for small firms. So a level of typically turnover during a particular accounting period that requires a firm to register for the VAT in their jurisdiction, and that combined with voluntary registration, a option for firms that are that do not meet that turnover threshold to, if they would like to, opt in to the VAT. Excuse me. Two pieces of these two pieces kind of work together to acknowledge a key shortcoming of VAT in practice, which is that it can be very complicated for small businesses. So let's have a threshold. There's just a huge body of research, empirical research showing that for small businesses, it is disproportionately costly to register for the VAT. And kind of, it depends on how you measure it, but like this is across jurisdictions, particularly for the invoice, or not particularly, but the invoice credit method or other, and this has led to, schemes for simplification, but this is sort of an empirical regularity that the registration threshold acknowledges. However, having a registration threshold, of course, goes against kind of the deepest theoretical premise of the VAT, which is that it's broad-based and that it covers, the entire economy in order to maximize the efficiency of the invoice credit system. And so the voluntary registration is sort of, it's kind of a saving grace of the registration threshold, because it allows firms that kind of want to get into the system and kind of figure that it's, as we'll talk about, kind of good for them to do that, to reclaim some of the lost production efficiency that results from having a threshold. And so this is the core background. And the question that has, connects to the motivation is, hold on, but why? Why would an entrepreneur choose to register? And that question is well theorized and studied. Like, there is a clear answer to that question in the literature that will be a surprise to know VAT maven. And this is the kind of, I call it the tax benefit model. An important recent paper studied this, kind of fleshed out a theoretical model with some empirical predictions that were tested and were, well validated. My paper kind of builds on that and uses that intuition to think more. So what's this existing answer here? Why would a small firm register? Well, if there is a small firm and a small firm entrepreneur and she has formal inputs, then there will be a benefit through the input tax credit to registering potentially. If she is in a situation where she can pass forward the cost of the output VAT, then that will allow her to kind of reap the benefit of the input credit, if any, but not bear the cost. And in terms of not bearing the cost, this can happen in two ways. Sort of generally, if she's selling to a registered customer, so in kind of a B2B transaction where the customer is, the buyer is formal, or if she's selling in a kind of a B2C, selling to a consumer or someone who's not registered for VAT, in a situation where she kind of has market power. She can pass forward the cost through adjusting of the VAT through adjusting the price. In this situation, her profits can increase or at least not decrease from registration. And so this has been, kind of well known and recently very thoroughly examined. So what am I bringing to the conversation? I should be clear here, I'm bringing no evidence, zero. And that is not the contribution. And that would be a really great contribution to make. But here I limit myself to simply offering the observation that this may be happening, and to try to focus our attention on the most likely sectors where this may be happening, and kind of connect that to how we think about the VAT and have been thinking about the VAT. And so really this whole discussion could be understood as a call for more research about how weather signaling may be a force, and the kind of design of such an empirical project is tricky, but I would love to talk about that. Okay, so what's this theoretical framework? This is the model of Michael Spence, who wrote a paper in the early 70s, laying this out in the context of kind of labor market and acquisition of education, sort of how employers may use the kind of observable amount of education that a candidate has invested in as a to gain information about her marginal product, her productivity, and therefore the kind of appropriate wage to offer the candidate. And so the background setting of this model, kind of abstracting away from the labor market, is that there must be, it doesn't apply unless there is a information asymmetry between buyers and sellers in a market, and kind of broadly. And so and that the private information is held by the seller side. There's another model that has it on the buyer side, but this is the seller side, and kind of pioneered it in that setting. The seller of the output has information about the quality of that output, and in the model it's two types only, high or low. And so she knows that she has a high quality output, let's say, but buyers do not know. They can't observe in the marketplace whether the output is high or low quality. And therefore they have a, kind of dilemma. Am I willing to pay a price commensurate with quality, the higher price that this supposedly high quality seller is demanding? Or am I only willing to pay, kind of like an average price in the market between high and low, in which case the high quality seller won't be able to cover the costs of her high quality product. And there may be kind of a follow-on effect of kind of an unraveling where high quality sellers actually won't be able to participate in the market because of this information asymmetry. And so that's kind of the end game of this very simple theoretical kind of framing of information asymmetry. So that has to be the background. So yeah, the buyers, if they're not sure the quality, may not be willing to pay. And so the kind of welfare outcome is kind of assumed to be not good, that it could be better if trade could occur between the high quality sellers and those seeking a high quality product. So in this background setting, this is kind of the matching idea. And so in this setting, there's two requirements for something to work as a signal. And this something is an action that is taken by the seller who has the private information about her output's quality. And this action can work or may work as a signal. And it's may, it's not a will, it's a may, if two requirements are met. The first is that the action needs to be observable by the buyers who lack the private information, and that they can observe it as being something that that required an investment, a costly investment by the seller. So this is something that qualifies in kind of the idiom in English, like it's not cheap talk. It's something that required a forbearance by the seller. And the second requirement is that the cost of taking this action varies inversely with the output's quality. And so the cost of taking the action needs to be low for high quality sellers and high for low quality sellers in such a kind of differential. The magnitude of the differential needs to be such that only a high quality seller will find it advantageous to take the costly action, to make the investment. And so under these conditions, the seller's action may emerge as a signal over successive rounds of interactions in this asymmetric market setting. And so this was an extremely important contribution that has been leveraged all over the academy, and a lot in the legal academy, and so it hasn't so much in tax, but it sufficiently kind of in very broad strokes described that weird cartoon at the beginning, that the paper is literally just me trying to understand how it would work. And so does an application of this model to VAT registration make sense? And anyway, so that's, here we are on the roadmap. Okay, so I'm just gonna go through, like, does the background setting apply? Arguably, yes. It's easy to imagine that for a small firm, because remember, these are only firms that are beneath the kind of registration threshold. Now, depending on the jurisdiction, that registration threshold may be extremely high. If it's a firm in Singapore, it may be a sizable firm, or it may be very low. A firm in Canada would need to be very small to kind of be in a position to not have to register. And if the registration threshold is 0, then it's a slightly different dynamic. And it's a question of compliance with the formality requirements versus non-compliance. But it's easy to think of in this setting that small firms may find it difficult to vouch for or to kind of validate their claims that they are selling an output of a specific quality. therefore to kind of convince buyers to pay the price that they need to recoup, especially for firms that are new and in well-established markets. And this also connects to kind of, I think, an aspect of this that that emphasizes the context specificity. This may be especially true depending on kind of buyers' background expectations of who should be in a given market, or who meets one's default presumptions about output of a certain quality. Here you could think like, who looks like a corporate lawyer? Who looks like someone who would be a good tailor. Those and it's, and you can imagine different scenarios for the sale of goods as well. And so to the extent that these observable characteristics, which actually are discussed in kind of a very interesting way in Spence's paper, to the extent that these observable, immutable characteristics condition one's expectations, then the use of signaling, may be, it speaks to the information asymmetry that may face those that are trying to communicate what they're offering in a as they come into a market, or as they participate over time in a market. And so with that background setting being, I will assert, plausible, what about requirement one? Is it possible? And so here we're asking, could the action of voluntary registration qualify as this observably costly investment that could potentially separate high quality sellers from low quality sellers? And here, kind of, is VAT registration costly? The empirical work that I mentioned earlier suggests that yes, it is, and that it is, and that particularly for the cohort that we're talking about, it can be disproportionately costly relative to revenues. Okay, that's my 20 minutes. I think I'm pretty much on target. And so, and so, sorry, that was the second bullet. But is it observable? Is VAT registration observable? And here it will depend on the jurisdiction, and I'll come back to this in the policy implications, but it's plausible that it would be. It certainly would be for those buyers that are sensitive to registration being in place, because they would need a kind of a formal invoice to claim the input credit. And so to the extent that they couldn't get that, it would, that interaction would be the route by which registration, voluntary registration, would be observable. Now, for consumers, unregistered consumers, would they know or would they care? Well, in Canada, for example, the VAT is required to be separately stated on the receipt. So there's a clear mechanism there for observability. It may be less so in other places where VAT can be kind of folded into the posted price, and therefore you wouldn't kind of know. So this is, kind of this requirement of observability is going to impact whether this model could apply, but to kind of allow us to move forward and see how it would work, that VAT registration can be observable is the presumption that I'm going to work on, and that it can be costly to do this. So then the second bullet point is really kind of where most of the paper struggles, or not struggles, but like the real kind of point at which it engages with the existing literature, because I've just told you that it's costly to register, but because this disproportional to turnover point, But the tax benefit model is premised on the observation that in net, voluntary registration, in fact, is profitable for some firms. So firms that have input credits and can pass on, or, through increased prices or to registered buyers, they're going to actually be in a cash positive position from registration. And that's in fact, how we observe things happening in the real world. And the Liu et al. Paper uses the full universe of UK firms to show this. And so, even though kind of instinctively we think, oh yes, it is going to be costly. That's the whole reason we have the registration threshold. If we, take the model and it's the evidence seriously, then it's not as straightforward. And so the contribution that I make here is to kind of narrow the signaling model into the universe of firms for which it would not be profitable. So to say, well, the requirements of the model, particularly requirement 1, can be met, but not for the firms to which the tax benefit model applies. And so this is sort of the kind of point that is made in the paper on this front to bifurcate the world or into firms to which the tax benefit model may apply, and then say for those to which it doesn't, we might see signaling. And this is I try to do this by mapping firms into kind of 4 boxes, 4 quadrants, depending on whether they have this input VAT benefit and whether they could pass forward their output VAT cost. And so to the extent that the input VAT benefit is high and the output VAT benefit is low, this quadrant 1, that's the tax benefit model, folks. Those are the firms for which registration voluntarily will be profitable. And then for those that have other combinations of input VAT benefits and output VAT costs, it may well be costly. And I show this by just adding, like in this kind of simple algebra, a term for compliance costs, which is what my signaling account relies on. And it simply adds in kind of a static sense, not a dynamic model like Liu et al.'s, consideration of compliance costs for this specific cohort of small firms that may have different input VAT benefits and output VAT costs. And so the argument here is that for all but quadrant 1 firms, which are essentially embedded in a formal supply chain, it is plausible that there would be positive costs, i.e. not offset by any benefits or by sufficient benefits of voluntary registration. And so requirement 1 may be met in practice. It's not contradicted by the tax benefit model for firms that can be described by quadrants 2, 3, and 4. And so, kind of, we may have snuck through for requirement 1. And hopefully I've convinced readers in the paper that it can coexist peacefully with the existing account. Because again, this is not an empirical claim, this is purely an observational one, a theoretical one. And so then we move to requirement 2. And that's where, some input about different contexts would be really interesting and useful to me. I propose a few ways in which the cost of voluntary registration may vary inversely with the quality of the seller's output. But there may be more, and people may disagree about this. These are proposals, but this is the second requirement, and it's necessary in order to to kind of get the benefits and the cost to diverge enough that only the high quality sellers would be taking this costly action. And so the first is just the basic concept of opportunity cost and how of registration and how that would connect to expectations for growth of small firms. For firms that have expectations of rapid future growth, then the time period that they expect to have kind of under the threshold where they will actually not be required to register is going to be shorter, and therefore the kind of the impending moment of required registration will be sooner. And so, just kind of getting it done essentially earlier and kind of in the phase where they may be dealing with other startup related legal compliance is plausible. For firms that are intentionally small, think, kind of farmers market heirloom tomato sellers, or, like in the paper, like a cat sitting firm, they may not actually expect to grow past the threshold. Here, obviously, the level of the threshold really matters. And so it wouldn't, that opportunity cost of non-registration would be, significant. And so they would kind of say, it doesn't make sense to rush this, this choice. I'm just going to hang out in my kind of expected size for this accounting period. So that's one way. The second way is kind of a level, like a pro-social commitment to legal compliance. And so, here the work, Rita's work is extremely relevant. I remember in Toronto, you told at your wonderful workshop, you told the story of the pine nuts. To the, like, that fraud is a huge problem and a significant phenomenon, to the extent that small sellers have a kind of internal commitment to compliance, kind of an intrinsic motivation to comply, and they may be more likely to essentially prefer to register, to signal this, or I'm using the word signal, but to show this. And that can, because it's just not as cumbersome or as burdensome to them, it's something that they think kind of should happen, and in the right kind of sort of social equilibrium would happen. And so they may be more willing to take that cost, that step. The cost may be lower. So there's this kind of pro-social, non-fraudster commitment possibility. The third possibility is just kind of very brass tacks, basic compliance ability for those kind of small suppliers that have higher ability to comply, find forms and legal requirements less intimidating. The perceived cost will be lower, and therefore, they will be more likely to register voluntarily. Here, the claim would be that those with high compliance ability would be those that sell a high quality output. This is, that would need to be empirically validated, but the claim is that kind of ability and kind of quality of, performance of legal duties and production of one's goods or services, would be of the same kind of high type, is the third proposal. This one is, has some pretty clear concerns on kind of the social and cultural expectations point, sort of saying, oh, those who, are adept at navigating the, kind of architecture of the state indicates that they are high quality, that they're doing high quality work. That is actually one of the things that hopefully signaling could be used to kind of interrogate and to say, well, actually, maybe no, someone who looks different may be able to do this. So I just want to flag that this claim that compliance ability may be correlated with quality is very, very specific to this kind of welfarist framework. And I can say more about that because it's something that I should probably say more about in the paper. Okay, so in terms of normative implications of this, to be clear, signaling is not any type of policy proposal or a policy that a social plan or a government could take. But, on balance, it seems likely that if it occurs in a given setting, that it may be a good thing. And this isn't always true. As Spence points out, and as others who have applied this model in different ways, signaling can actually be welfare reducing. The cost of sending the signal can kind of converge to something where that cost, or the way that it's distributed across actors in the market, would reduce aggregate welfare, but people would still do it because of the dynamic that had emerged. Here, I think my conclusion is that because it's tax, and because it's tax compliance, and because specifically of the structure of the VAT, which really requires and reaps benefits from broad-based registration, that the welfare kind of a welfarist assessment of signaling would be that it's a good thing, that it increases welfare. And so kind of looking at this from a private and a public perspective, I think is helpful. And so, asking, would there be private gains? And to say, well, yeah, hopefully through matching of buyers and sellers with the kind of the right type of output that they're willing to pay for. Here, no normative thing of good or bad or high, high or low is just simply the price that needs to be compensated. And so there, gains from trade that would not otherwise occur could. But that needs to assume that the cost of sending the signal doesn't swamp those. So yes, it's plausible that there would be private gains, but I think it's even more convincing that there would be public gains, because there's this kind of quality selection happening. And so, the signal, the kind of signaling model requires that that only those with high quality output are going to be selecting in. And if governments could observe this, then they would just require those firms to select in the first place. Voluntary registration is non-mandatory because, from the government's perspective, requiring all small firms to register may, and again, this is like a policy assessment informed by empirical evidence, but requiring everyone to register would impose costs on the tax agency administration and enforcement that would swamp any gains that they would get. Any revenue would be so much smaller than that. And so, to the extent that signaling is happening and it's pushing the high quality folks into the VAT system, high quality output is kind of in the way that I'm reducing it to this really kind of single word, implies kind of firms that are going to survive and that are going to, kind of net over time, generate some revenue. So it's signaling, I think, can enhance the dynamic that tax agencies hope would be happening with the mechanism of voluntary registration. It may, in fact, just simply be the word that we want to apply to the phenomenon, from the tax agency's perspective. Maybe not, but from a tax agency perspective, one hopes that the high quality firms would be the ones opting in and not the fraudsters who are seeking to monetize, the gains from from the system. So yes, revenue may be likely to be positive, and for this, it's important to kind of, or it's I think more convincing if one focuses on these kind of quadrant 4 firms that have very few input tax benefits and are least likely to be able to pass along the cost. For those firms, those are the firms that are most likely to stay informal. And all of the value added, all of the kind of taxable surplus would escape, to the extent that those firms are the ones for whom, kind of it would be most beneficial because it's so costly, and they actually do opt in. That is just absolutely positive in terms for the tax agency to get that that revenue that would have otherwise leaked. And so, this I think, and to the extent that it's also the kinds of taxpayers who are going to need little administrative assistance and not require enforcement resources, then all the better. Okay, so so hopefully signaling, if it happens, would be good. And here is where we get to policy implications, and I hope that I've been successful in entirely hollowing out any claims you thought that this paper would make from the title. I am not providing any empirical evidence that this is happening. I'm not making any non-conditional claims about whether it's good or bad. But if these certain kind of conditions are met, then I think it is plausible that we would see this kind of dynamic. And then the interesting question is, and so hopefully we could, quantify that or study that or sort of get some sense of that. The study that was done for the UK tax agency was wonderful in this regard, because the way they asked the survey questions, now it didn't establish anything causal, but the way it asked the survey questions suggested that this was happening. And there may be other ways to do this, but kind of if it were happening, what would this mean for policymakers on this very controversial issue of the level of the threshold in particular? And so, kind of again, there's so many ifs in this paper, but that's because it's merely a theoretical contribution. So if signaling is occurring and it is on balance welfare increasing, so I want to just kind of assume that, because if it's not, then we have a different conversation about how to shut it down, like get rid of voluntary registration altogether, perhaps, then there may be some implications. And so the first may be kind of thinking about optimal registration threshold setting, which itself is, most, like anyone who's read Michael Keane and Jack Mintz's 2004 paper, exceedingly complicated. We might want to add this kind of signaling piece to that dynamic and think about how that might affect the optimal registration threshold. The instinct, without thinking through it formally, for me is that you may want to create additional space for signaling to occur to the extent that you think it promotes welfare. And then, and sort of the more kind of conservative point may be, well, that the optimal registration threshold model of Keane and Mintz had actually two equilibria that emerged from their model, and it was a very, very low threshold or a very, very high threshold. And so to the extent signaling is happening, maybe that puts a thumb on the scale and gives us a reason to say, well, actually, no, the very, very low threshold would sacrifice the possible welfare benefits from signaling. That would require more work to say convincingly, but it's a conjecture that I think flows from this possible dynamic. And the second is and this is more tractable, I think, to think about from a policy perspective, the requirement one observability point is obviously crucial. And to the extent that that there, kind of maybe the social norms in place that are kind of pointing towards using that registration as a signal, perhaps the tax agency could support and reinforce that by providing some mechanism, some kind of official channel, or, like a sticker that a restaurant grade or something like that, that sellers could almost like a licensing regime that sellers could display and would be easily and reliably observable to buyers. And that would be, I think, fairly low cost. It's interesting from like a, kind of a tax morale standpoint as well, but that might be one of the implications. With that, I thank you so much for your listening to this, and I look forward to your reactions, your questions, your challenges, and to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. It was very, very interesting. I have some comments, but I'll pass first for Professor Rita de la Feria, and after we see if our audience has some questions. So Rita, please.
Yes, Emily, this is truly a fascinating paper, and I have loads of comments to you. I guess I'll start with a theoretical framework and some kind of things that are some issues that occurred to me as you were presenting. So I think that there is, to put into context, I think that there has been an awareness at policy level that signaling has an impact. But as you actually highlighted in the discussion, this has not been part of the academic literature on tax. So in tax, we haven't really been discussing this issue. The assumption is that people will register voluntarily when it's rational to do so from a tax perspective. But when you have discussions on the ground, policymakers will say, oh, maybe people will just want to, signal that they are bigger, or they want to, boast to their friends that they have a big business or whatever, right? So this is an active discussion at policy level, but there wasn't really any theoretical work done on it. I think that there is kind of two kind of sub-reasons why people can do this. And I think that one is hinted in your discussion, and I'm not sure you have considered the other one. So one is that they do this for rational reasons that are not tax. Okay, so they, which is the model that you were talking about, the Spencer model that you were talking about. You're doing this because you want to attract other businesses, you want to look, more marketable, more successful, etc. And that's like a rational non-tax reason, right? But then I think there is another category of non-rational reasons, which I think that they were not as well understood even 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So for example, just a sheer optimism bias, right? You think that you're going to be more successful, or, perception of self-worth. You want to see yourself as a big entrepreneur, and this is part of reinventing yourself and so on. So I think maybe in addition to the framework that you have constructed is to consider that there are these two subparts. Some rational reasons that are not tax reasons, some rational reasons that are non-tax reasons, and non-rational reasons that are to do with behavioral biases and heuristics, etc., right? So that's kind of point one on the framework. The point two on the framework is that I was thinking about, I know you mentioned that you didn't want to look at dynamic issues, but I was just thinking about the practice, which is common as an anti-fraud and anti-avoidance practice of having a stay-in rule for voluntary registration. A lot of countries apply stay-in rules, say that if you voluntarily register, you have to stay in for 5 years. Now that massively changed the dynamics of commitments that you were even mentioning. So if you have stay in for 5 years, it's 5 years of compliance. If you have to stay in for 1 year to see if your business is going to work, or if you have more customers because of that, that's a very different assessment. So the tax signaling may depend on whether you have those anti-avoidance rules or not, because the cost side of registering increases massively if you have to stay in, right? So I think that that's an interesting dynamic as well. And then finally, on the tax policy implications, and I think you were really modest on this, and I think that there's massive implications. And I think the biggest implication is actually what you said, is to even factor this in, because even though there was a sense that this was happening, because there was no theoretical work on this, it wasn't factored in on the setting of the threshold. And I think this has big implications for the setting of the threshold, because the setting of the threshold is connected to administrative costs, right? Now, if you have a bunch of people signaling, then your administrative costs increase. Now, maybe that you still want the threshold at the same level, but maybe you don't. So if you suspect that there's a lot of signaling in the market, you might want to increase your threshold and have a higher threshold to limit the number of taxpayers that you have to deal with, just because your administrative costs increase. So I think that there is, I think that there is a really big implications on this. I wanted to say two more things. I'm sorry to kind of be so many stuff for you to deal with, but two more things. One is that because of the signaling is country dependent, and it will be industry dependent and so on, I think that there might be an argument how this area is really an area where it's particularly unsuitable for legal transplants. So I wanted to hear your opinion on this, right? Because there is a tendency in developed countries, as you know, of just transposing your tax policy into other contexts and thinking that everything is going to be all right, right? And there is loads of instances of how tax transplants have gone wrong. But I think this particular area, and if you take into account, for many reasons, but also the tax signaling reason, is an area where it shows the kind of the risks of these legal transplants and how tax policy really, you can have a best practice, kind of accepted best practice, but that best practice has to cater for local constraints, and particularly market and administrative constraints. And those were my comments. One more, which is kind of how this also shows, in my opinion, how linked policy is to administration. And it's one of those areas that you can see there is really a symbiotic nature between the two. And with this, I'll shut up. And I thank you again for a great paper. I hope my comments will help developing some aspects of it. But I look forward to further discussions that we'll have on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rita. That is incredibly helpful. I really appreciate it.
Emily, I think I have only one question here, but I didn't understand very well. It's saying that in VAT system, under VAT system, we have big and small business, and for small business, without power to buy products of high quality products, how can this small business be part of this VAT system? I'm not sure if understood. Also, Emily, I know I was hearing you, and I was thinking about two things. One thing is about, I think you have other research, not exactly this one, but I can see, I don't have any research on this, but my feeling and experience under a VAT system is that registration is very related to the fact that under the VAT system, small business can now recover input tax credits. So I'd like you to develop in your research, what do you think about this? Did you see some correlation between the fact that input tax credits under VAT system is important in the aspect to opt to decide to register or not? And also just a quick comment about Brazil, because Brazil doesn't have a threshold, but we have a special system named Simples. I think, I sent you some papers. And this system was created not only in respect of these high compliance costs that thresholds are, you said in your presentation, is the reason of this threshold system, but also because the high tax burden if you don't opt to this system. So it's not kind of voluntarily, but kind of essential here for a small business in Brazil to survive, because if they don't follow this simples, this special system, they will have not only high compliance costs, but also a very high tax burden. And what is interesting here is because the threshold is very high, it's like kind of $1 million US, and includes not only indirect taxes, not only VAT, and we cannot say Brazil has a VAT, but the indirect taxes, but also corporate income tax, payroll taxes, and so under the current system in Brazil, small business do not want to opt out, to leave this system. And so there are many empirical research showing that. So when they reach this threshold of 1 million, they do other things, other kind of strategies to not leave the system, because the current system is so crazy, so bad that they don't want to leave. So what happened in the tax reform in Brazil is, because we implement a VAT system, maybe be part of this small business systems simples will not be viewed as a good thing, because simples will not be part of VAT, and you have like 8% of our businesses, not only small business, more than 8%, 80% of the business in Brazil. So can you believe 80%? And so I was wondering if you have some thoughts on this, especially because we are trying to implement a VAT system, and under the VAT system, maybe we have some kind of this business under the system. Maybe they want to opt in to VAT system and not stay in simples. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. Thank you, Emily.
Can I just say something else, Melina? Because what Melina just said, Emily, just spark another thought of mine. Whether tax signaling is dependent also on how high the threshold is. What I mean by that is that if the threshold is, $50,000, it's a much bigger embarrassment to be below the threshold than if the threshold is $1 million. So the social stigma and the kind of the signaling element might be much more intense if the threshold is low, because, I mean, how many will be, 1 million? No, it's not credible that, that a small plumber or a small electrician will be 1 million, but you might not want to say if you are below 20,000 or below 30,000. So the intensity of the signaling might depend also on the level of the threshold that already exists. So this just occurred to me when Melina was talking, that in Brazil, if it's $1 million, maybe the signaling won't be as strong than if, like Portugal is at 10,000 euros, which honestly, it's an embarrassment if you are below 10,000 euros as a business, right?
Yeah, amazing. No, thank you, Melina. Those that is exactly the kind of those are exactly the kinds of questions that I would like to think about with respect to this, where it really gets into what systems are in practice with all the different contours, because the extent, like it speaks to the context dependency and the kind of hazards of legal transplanting that Rita talked about. And so to kind of make a policy prescription without paying attention to this is obviously ill-advised. But yeah, I'd love to get into the details. And Rita, your point matches really, really well with that at the end about kind of, because really this is all about social norms. This is a theory of social norms, the work of Eric Poser and Richard McAdams and Lee Fennell, there's a whole body of work that thinks about law in this way. And it's I think it's a lovely kind of melding of law and society and law and economics. But the point here about the electrician, being affected differentially, or the house cleaner being affected differentially under a very high threshold regime versus one that's more modest, and how that interacts with simplified systems like Simplis seems absolutely critical. So would you like to, I would love to hear all of what you have to say, because I actually think you probably have, kind of better thoughts on how this may work, or not better, but I would love to hear what you have to say, full stop. Or do you want me to offer just some thoughts on the points that you guys just made?
Yes, please, Emily.
Okay. No, that would be a pleasure. Yeah, sorry for any clicking here and dog coughing, and but I was just wanted to write down everything. So Rita, I'll start with your first point. That about there's these kind of two categories of reasons that small firms or sub-threshold firms would opt in: the rational reasons, which is kind of what the tax benefit model talks about, and what the Spence model, how the Spence model would be applied, how I'm applying it, would cover. And then there's these non-rational reasons, the optimism bias that you're talking about, this issue of kind of thinking of oneself as being big. That is, I think, incredibly important to study. The extent to which different categories of taxpayers would be more or less likely to have those beliefs. I have some theories, but that would really matter for, in particular, or just kind of most immediately, for the tax agency to understand in terms of how they allocate administrative resources to the folks that are opting in. And this kind of gets to your second point about how you might want to adjust it to not have too many people opting in. But I think, if this is a big phenomenon, this kind of non-rational stuff, then, here we are it would move us into a different world, into a behavioral world, away from the predictions, kind of away from the discussion that I'm proposing. And I have no kind of stake in, which is which. I would really love to see work trying to figure out, how the kind of relative strength of these different categories and how within the categories it works. Is optimism bias a really big deal? Is it more of a shame, kind of a shame and smallness type of thing? Like, how are taxpayers thinking about this in a particular setting? And it might be extremely local, or, as you say, industry specific, but understanding that would really matter for how, just with respect to the threshold, you would want to think about it in terms of the level. The kind of pure VAT theory counsels against having, service specific, kind of industry specific rates. Simplified systems are, I think, and from my understanding of it, Simplis could be put in this category, are themselves a concession to just the really difficult challenges that are faced by many taxpayers in complying with a broad-based full kind of VAT. And so, to kind of throw those to the wind on the basis of, a signaling account, doesn't seem to make sense. But I think the implication, and here I'm kind of jumping to Melina's point, the implication is that, if signaling is happening, then you kind of muddy the waters by having these other systems, because, it's not, signaling relies on the quality of the information being conveyed by that action being, good, having informational content there. And if there are kind of many different choices, then it may be harder to make inferences. But also, to your to your point, Rita, you know, to the extent that there's these non-rational reasons happening, then it just may mean that it's not, you know, like signaling, you know, may mean different things, you know, like sort of let's, if you're a certain type of taxpayer that we, you know, think may be more susceptible to optimism bias, then, you know, the inference there would be like, actually, you registering is not a particularly good signal of the quality of your output. It just, you know, bombast. But for another kind of taxpayer, the signal of registration actually would be that would be correspond to high quality output would actually be stronger. And so getting those kind of population, like having a good understanding of the population in a very specific sense would be ideal. Now, of course, that's the huge challenge of tax generally. And so at the point where, you know, with all these caveats, query whether the entire discussion collapses on itself. You know, I want to go with your positivity, Rita, you know, that like, no, there actually could be implications. And I do think acknowledging it is important. Like, you know, things are complex. I have no interest in trying to abstract away, you know, or whitewash or, you know, kind of paint over that, that complexity. But I do think that that awareness, you know, I hope that, to your point, awareness of possible signaling, these kind of rational reasons and what different trends may be among different communities of sellers may be helpful. And so, yeah, that's kind of my reaction to your sort of two category point, that if there is a lot of behavioral kind of stuff happening, non-rational stuff happening, then it would be at odds to the dynamic that I'm suggesting for sure. And so you know, just a real need for understanding that. Your second point about the anti-fraud and anti-avoidance rules. This is great, and I think that's exactly right. Like I focus on just this, you know, most visible parameter in terms of policy implications, the level of the threshold, and I talk about this kind of marketing point of like the seal of that registration or something like that. But how it implicates these more specific rules, like the stay-in rule, the existence of simplified systems, that's key. And so a stay-in rule, Canada actually has a version of this. Melina, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but it does. To your point, it does raise the cost or kind of affect the level of risk that a small supplier would rationally perceive when making the choice to voluntarily register. They can't undo it as easily. And there may be liability and real costs in trying to undo it. And I've heard some kind of crazy stories about this in Canada. And so there, if you think that it's another gatekeeping mechanism, essentially, that could work in tandem with the registration threshold, where if you think that signaling may have the effect of kind of sweeping more people than would, more sellers than would be optimal into the VAT, kind of an optimal from like a, you know, an overall welfare perspective, taking into account the tax agency clearly here. So if the tax agency thought that would sweep too many taxpayers in, that it wouldn't be advantageous, you know, or kind of net revenue positive, then using the stay-in rule, you know, and also politically, it might be a tool that could, you know, sort of increase the essentially barriers of sending the signal, and might help the tax agency optimize. And because it, you know, it's just almost like a refinement on the threshold. And the political economy of this, again, thinking about, you know, your recent work, Rita, you know, is really crucial. You know, like I don't don't have a good sense of how, I mean, changing the registration threshold is a big deal. And so if these other rules might have similar impacts, as they're seen in this context, then that may be a very useful thing for tax agencies to acknowledge in terms of, even things like technical assistance. So yeah, and I would be very curious as to your reactions to that reaction. Policy, your point about policy implications, I totally agree. And then to kind of the last point, signaling or kind of the caveat almost, here's how I understand what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong. All the caveats that I'm emphasizing on the signaling model and its basic character as a window into how social norms affect tax choices, because essentially it's all about non-tax reasons. It has nothing to do with tax. That's the tax benefit model. I'm talking about all these non-tax reasons, but of course they affect tax. And, all these non-tax reasons, that if those are important, which is the claim, or that they could be important, then a legal transplant can't just focus on kind of the, hard, cold tax pieces. It has to have attention to the non-tax kind of reasons and culture and sort of changing trends in a given population, which are going to be affected by all sorts of things. So I think I would really agree with that. And that was one of the struggles with this paper, is to be sufficiently kind of non-committal in the sense of, like there's the construct of, high quality corresponding with low complianceability, high quality corresponding with high complianceability. That may be true in a certain population with access to, forms and education and good internet and things like that. But that's really going to depend, and it's going to probably depend on the sector that we're talking about, and specifically, sort of just foisting a legal transplant without attention to that. I agree that this could be another reason to be cautious about that. I think that that's it for your comments, and I may be missing something. So remind me if I am. Melina, or start, let's say, with the question. I think that in the chat, how I understood that question, and here, I think that what that question may have been asking, or at least this is how I've been thinking about it, is, how could, because it's such small businesses, how could this actually work for the smallest, kind of the quadrant 4 sellers that have no formal inputs, no tax credits to claim, no kind of B2B transactions to that would allow them to pass on, or no pricing power. People really, in the sectors that are most likely to be informal, how would this work? And that's actually the, the whole motivation for the paper, is to say, well, gosh, it could work, but there would be a lot of pieces that would be saying that, for like a cat sitter, for example, that, the dynamics were such that all of the cat sitter's customers would be looking to the cat sitter's voluntary VAT registration as a proxy for for the safety of their cat. And that may seem like an outlandish claim, but in places where there's, kind of a certain situation, like kind of where tax morale is situated a certain way, and where taxes come to be understood as kind of having like a certain cultural significance, that could, that would be of interest to kind of understand and to figure out the policy implications of. And so I hope that makes sense, but it really, I guess I just want to emphasize that the upside of this is really important because it's exactly that quadrant that, it would be entirely untaxed. There would be no piece of that supply chain that would have gotten into the VAT system absent voluntary registration. So the gains could be significant. Simples. Your first question, kind of like what I was seeing, Melina, I can connect with you about that afterwards. It's really interesting, but I don't want to talk too long. I'm just aware of time. The Simples system seems really critical because it's almost a second kind of world in which there may be kind of, you could analogize the voluntary registration into kind of like the non-Simples system. So then just move it down a notch, and then it's the choice between Simples and informality. And one of the key papers, on kind of chain effects and VAT, you studied the Simples system, and it's using older data, but it found, and there's certainly other papers that I should be aware of on this using evidence from Brazil that the introduction of Simples did increase formality and formal chains of and formal supply chains. And so there, if it may be that being part of Simples versus being entirely informal may have some signaling content, particularly, and to the extent that, the 1 million threshold is so high, then being part of the Simples system, even though there is a 0 threshold, that might be the sort of thing, just to use the example of the electrician, where the electrician would say, like, the 1 million threshold obviously doesn't apply to me, but the, to the extent that being part of Simples is observable, and that, if that makes me seem, for non-tax reasons, more attractive, more trustworthy, whatever, more pro-social to my clients, then, maybe I would want to opt in, and that might be some kind of dynamic that could work. Because I think your instinct is the same as mine, which is that, having the tiered systems, is absolutely, seems totally justified from, just an observational standpoint and seeing how these systems work in practice. But if you're going to just, mechanically apply this sort of signaling model, well then, yeah, like it may add a level of complexity that could mean that, that dynamic couldn't emerge. But I think, maybe it could emerge in different, in, again, really granular ways, where if participation in Simples was observable, which I don't know how observable it is, perhaps a set of norms could emerge that where firms were rewarded for participation in Simples, just as, I'm suggesting they may be rewarded for participation in the full VAT. And in terms of kind of federal VAT adoption or full VAT adoption and what that would mean, yeah, I think, it seems quite complicated, but I think I would take very seriously the kind of comments that that you were making, and I, if I was in charge, about the challenges to people on the ground in different sectors, because and it just dovetails very well with Rita's point about legal transplanting. Could even think of it, within a given system, not wanting to transplant a set of ideas which might apply to larger businesses into another sector, that would actually be inappropriate. So thank you so much for those comments. They're incredibly helpful and so interesting.
Thank you, Emily. It was like great session to close our webinar series. So thank you very much. I'll pass to Rita, if Rita wants to say something, because it's our last session, unfortunately, Rita.
Yes, so I'll just say first to Emily, thank you so much for coming. It has been first of all, it's a great paper, it's a great discussion, but also it has been a personal pleasure to see you again. I hope we'll see each other again in person, not before too long, or before too long, sorry. So I'll just say now a few final words in Portuguese, if that's okay with you, Emily. Só para agradecer mais uma vez a Melina, também ao Isaías e ao Eurico que não estão aqui, e a todas as pessoas da FGV, que a maioria do público não vê, mas que nós aqui na sala do Zoom vemos, e que estão aqui têm estado todas as semanas, nas últimas 5 semanas, não é, Melina? 5 semanas têm estado aqui a apoiar estes webinars, não só na perspectiva logística, mas também no sentido eletrónico, mas também na tradução destes seminários de português para inglês e de inglês para português, numa base constante. Por isso também para agradecer às pessoas da FGV, que o público que está no YouTube não vê, mas que nós vemos todas as semanas. Pela minha parte acho que é tudo. Tem sido um enorme prazer participar nestes webinars, como foi o ano passado. Espero ver o público brasileiro outra vez, se possível, não digitalmente. A minha preferência seria para ver ao vivo e a cores, mas de qualquer modo espero reencontrar-vos a todos muito brevemente. E é isto. Obrigada, Melina.
So thank you, Emily, again, and congratulations on your new position. And I hope you're not leaving VAT, because you're back in the United States, please, because it's not like a hot topic in the United States to research about VAT. So thank you again, and I will finish also in Portuguese. Muito obrigada a todos que acompanharam essas sessões durante essas 5 semanas. Nós vamos programar para o ano que vem também mais uma sessão, né, Rita, dessas, até que a reforma tributária saia, mesmo que sair, a gente vai continuar discutindo.
Até podemos combinar outras coisas. Acho que o Eurico está a planear ainda outros eventos. Stay tuned.
Agora, talvez ainda nesse ano, exatamente no segundo semestre, né, vamos ver, a gente vai anunciar aí. Bom, eu queria agradecer novamente o professor Isaías e o Eurico, que infelizmente hoje não puderam estar com a gente, eles que coordenam o NEF, né, que é um grande centro de pesquisas do Brasil, que tem colaborado muito nas discussões de reforma tributária. Agradecer novamente a presença da Rita, que é essencial aí na organização, no convite e na apresentação dos papers dela, que ela apresenta aqui de primeira mão, né, Rita? Inéditos, papers e pesquisas inéditas. Então, a gente fica muito feliz com a presença dela no debate da reforma tributária brasileira. E a todos que nos assistiram, seja pelo YouTube, seja pelo Zoom, e a toda a equipe da FGV, como a Rita bem mencionou, que estavam sempre presentes. So, thank you very much, Emily. See you soon, I hope, and see you in the next webinar, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Bye, Emily. Bye, Rita.